Hello everyone, this is Spartacus and Other Slave Rebellions in Rome. This is Kings and Generals. It's a very new channel. I've never done them before, so if you've ever seen any of the videos, it's obviously digital. So I'm going to break this down into 3 videos, 3 pits, and we're going to go ahead and start now. This was not a request, by the way. I've been on Kings and Generals, and so I'm just looking at their videos, and they got some good stuff.
After its final victory over Carthage in the Third Punic War in 146 BC, the Roman Republic was enjoying a period of relative peace, having established itself as the dominant power in the Mediterranean. However, when there are not enemies abroad, enemies within will emerge. This is the story of the Servile Wars, a string of 3 slave rebellions that rocked the Republic in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, culminating in the famous gladiator revolt and last stand led by Spartacus. This video is brought to you by the Ridge Wallet. We've been using Ridge Wallets for almost a year now. They don't fold, don't budge in your pocket, and are light, with a modern
Go get a Ridge Wallet.
Generals. Though Spartacus's revolt in 73 BC is the most well known today, it was by no means the first. That honour belongs to the one which happened in Sicily 60 years earlier in 135 BC. The Romans had conquered the majority of the island at the end of the First Punic War in 241 BC. Previous conquests on the Italian peninsula had resulted in annexation, and the locals in the areas, the Socii, were granted a substantial degree of autonomy. Though contributing troops to the Republic, they were not required to pay tribute, and they were treated more as allies, with Rome holding hegemonic power. Meanwhile, Sicily became the first Roman province, and so was a different case. Not only was it a mix of numerous different cultures, but it was also a place of substantial wealth thanks to its fertile lands and ideal location. As a result, the Romans imposed a new system of provincial rule over the island, with a governor being assigned and tribute collected. Although the province was under Roman rule, the Carthaginians still had substantial interest and influence there, and it would not be until after the Second Punic War in 201 BC that these last Carthaginian vestiges were forced from the island. Following the war, sympathizers of the Carthaginian cause had their land confiscated, resulting in huge swathes of land being claimed by the Republic. This fertile but cheap land attracted many investors who bought huge tracts and began establishing vast estates, precursors to latifundia. Slavery was rife, not only in Sicily but throughout the Mediterranean, and large numbers of these slaves were brought to Sicily in order to work the farms of the estates. However, conditions were poor. Many landowners did not provide enough food or clothing for the slaves, who as a result were often forced to turn to banditry and plundering to survive. Though this was a constant worry for the senators in Rome, the
Slaves were allowed to just go out and pillage? Did I understand that right? Did I hear that right? That doesn't make sense. I'm sure I didn't hear it right.
lands in Sicily were often held by powerful equites who had judiciary powers. Thus, whenever charges were brought against the landowners, they were simply dismissed. With the Senate effectively powerless, it was only a matter of time before such a disenfranchised group were unified and rose in revolt, something that finally happened in 135 BC. Eunice was a Syrian slave, one of many who had been brought over to the island and now lived in the city of Enna. But instead of being a labourer, he was somewhat of an entertainer. He performed magic tricks, fire-breathing, and claimed to have divine visions and messages that prophesied him becoming a king. Antigenes, Eunice's master, would often parade Eunice at dinner parties, having him perform his tricks and laughing at his claims to kingship. However, the slaves in Enna were treated particularly badly, and when they conspired to revolt in 135 BC, they turned to Eunice as their leader, inspired by his proclamations of divine favour. The revolt began when 400 of these slaves rose up in Enna, killing their masters along with their masters' wives and children, and gathering other slaves in the city to their cause. The revolt was brutal. Kangaroo courts were established and the accused tortured and executed, and Yunus ordered that all of the wealthy male citizens of Enna be hunted down and killed, save for those who could forge weapons. These the slaves themselves put into chains and forced them to work producing weapons for the rebels. Yunus proclaimed himself king and took the name Antiochus after the famous Seleucid king. Soon he was able to assemble and arm a force of 6,000 slaves.
Well, he kind of was right. He was a king. He became one.
Some with proper weaponry, others with more basic weapons, slings, hatchets, and rudimentary spears. Having been forced into a life of banditry by their masters, most had at least some fighting experience, and some had even been soldiers who had been enslaved as prisoners of war or bodyguards. With this force assembled, he began ravaging the countryside and gathering still more men to his cause until his army numbered some 10,000. The Romans did make attempts to quell the revolt. However, they had not fully realized the seriousness of the situation, and the small forces that they sent to deal with the rebels were quickly overcome by sheer force of numbers. Soon after this, another group of slaves on Sicily revolted, this time led by a slave and infamous brigand called Cleon. He had been a fighter since his youth in Asia Minor, and upon hearing of Yunus's success had seized upon the opportunity. The Romans initially hoped that these two factions would fight and thus destroy each other, but instead, Cleon sided with Yunus, bringing a further 5,000 men to his cause and acting as his general. Together they were able to capture the city of Acragas, whose defences had been left in disrepair. The slaves were careful to target the wealthy, mostly leaving the lower classes alone, and due to the huge economic disparity in Sicily, many of the lower class even rallied to Yunus, further swelling his numbers. After a month,
yeah, they probably feel like they have a grudge against the high class, the rich. They probably blame them for, oh, we're poor because of you. Oh, yeah.
Roman praetor Lucius Hypsaeus was sent with 8,000 Sicilian militia to quell the revolt. Though the fact that a praetor was sent shows that the Romans were now taking the revolt more seriously, they were still not doing enough. By this time, Yunus and Cleon had 20,000 men under their command. The 8,000 militia proved no match for their more numerous and determined rivals and were quickly routed. Following this, the revolt spread even further across the island, the slaves taking numerous cities and rallying still greater numbers to their cause. 3 other praetors with similar-sized forces were also sent against the rebels, each being defeated in turn. Their success inspired revolts in other parts of the Republic, small revolts rising in both Rome itself and Greece, although both of these were quickly crushed before they could develop. In 133 BC, the revolt in Sicily was still going strong though, the slaves' numbers now growing to as many as 60,000, controlling the majority of the island's key cities and even minting their own coins. But Rome now decided to act with force, sending an army headed by the consul Lucius Piso. Under his command, the Romans were able to make their first significant gains, recapturing Morgantina, killing 8,000 slaves in the battle and crucifying those taken as prisoners.
Oh, damn.
This would act as a turning point in the Romans' fortunes. The following year, another consul, Publius Rupilius, was also sent to the island. Rupilius began a ruthless campaign to finally quell the rebellion. He first besieged the city of Tauromenium, forcing the rebels inside to resort to cannibalism. Finally, a slave called Serapion betrayed the rebels, opening the gates to the Romans. The Romans stormed the city, and the slaves, starved and in no condition to fight, put up little resistance. Rupilius ordered that all the slaves be rounded up, tortured, and then thrown off a cliff. Following this, he marched to the rebels' de facto capital of Enna, where Cleon was stationed, and once again besieged the city. Realizing that he would soon face the same fate as those at Tauromenium, Cleon decided to sally out, preferring to die in battle than starve.
I'm just trying to see if it's going to catch up, because it shouldn't still be showing this picture. Sorry, my internet's a little glitchy. Okay.
Behind the city walls. He fought bravely, but was nonetheless cut down, his body displayed.
What is it with the Romans and crucifying everyone? God damn! Knock it off!
By Rupilius to those still defending the city walls. The rebels' morale broke at the sight, and once again they were betrayed, with the Romans seizing the city. Eunice had not been present during the siege, but upon hearing of the death of his general and fall of Enna, he fled with 1,000 men into the mountains. By this point, the slaves knew they were defeated. Rupilius's ruthless tactics had worked in breaking the morale of the rebels, and the few who remained with Eunice knew that Rupilius would soon be marching on them next. Rather than face the brutal punishments of Rupilius, the slaves instead decided to behead each other rather than be taken alive.
What's that now?
When Rupilius arrived in the
How does that work? Because what if one person, like everyone swings at the same time? What if one person doesn't swing hard enough and just kind of like half decapitates you? Ugh. Laying there with your head barely attached. You're looking over at old Ralph. What a dick. Ralph didn't even have the strength to do it. Ralph's head's just rolling around. He's blinking at you. He's like, hey, what's going on? You're like, hey, look what you did, dick. You didn't even finish the job. Or there was one person who decapitated everyone and was like, no, I swear I'm going to do it too, guys. I promise. And they just skipped away.
Mountains, he found Eunice with a few close friends hiding in a cave. The slave leader was dragged out and imprisoned. Though the Romans planned to torture and execute Eunice as they had with other slaves, he died of illness in prison before they could. The following year, 131, Rupilius was left in Sicily with a select group of soldiers to mop up the remnants of the revolt. But with the deaths of Cleon and Eunice, the First Servile War was over. In total, the war had cost the Romans as many as 20,000 in battle, as well as an unknown number of civilians. Although the revolt had little
Anybody know where those two, Eunice and was it Cleon? Anyone know where if they have a place like a grave or something, a monument for them or anything?
Effect on the Republic, they did become an inspiration for later slaves seeking to overthrow their masters. In 104 BC, just 30 years after the First Servile War, Sicily would once again be plunged into the chaos of a slave uprising. The Roman Republic had spent the last few years in long and difficult wars. The Jugurthine War of 112 to 106 BC, and the ongoing Cimbrian War, which started in 113 BC. Following the conclusion of the Jugurthine War, its victor and one of Rome's best generals, Gaius Marius, had been given command of the Cimbrian War. The war had already cost Rome and her allies almost 60,000 men, forcing Marius to conduct a mass recruitment campaign in order to bolster his numbers. As a result, he had asked Nicomedes III of Bithynia for soldiers. However, Nicomedes replied saying that he would be unable to do so, as the majority of Bithynians suitable for military service had been seized as slaves by Romans for not being able to pay their taxes. The Senate responded by issuing a decree that no citizen of an allied state could be held as a slave in a Roman province. This decision was made in the hopes that it would provide Marius the manpower he would need to defeat the Cimbri, but would also cost the Republic dearly. In 104 BC, Publius Licinius Nerva, the propraetor of Sicily, wanting to quickly carry out the Senate's decree in his province, immediately set around 800 slaves of allied nations free. This decision not only alienated slaves of other nations, but also angered the nobles who owned large amounts of slaves, worried that they were going to lose their workforce. Through bribes and political pressure, Nerva quickly caved to the nobles, refusing to free any more slaves and sending those that appealed back to their masters. As a result of this, 180 slaves outside of Syracuse revolted, killing their masters, taking up arms, and fortifying a hilltop location. Nerva quickly mustered together a force of soldiers and marched on the slaves. However, he did not have enough men to fully conduct a siege of their fortifications. Instead, he used loyal slaves to pretend to defect, enter the fortifications, and then betray the rebels, allowing the Romans to storm the fortifications. Some of the slaves were killed in the fighting, whilst others, fearing capture, took their own lives. Nerva disbanded his troops shortly after. However, a much larger rebellion had taken place almost simultaneously. 80 slaves had risen up and killed Publius Clonius and Equites, and, having been left to their own devices, had managed to gather 800 slaves on Mount Caprianus outside Heracleia in just 1 week. As Nerva had not been aware of this uprising, and so had not taken any action against them, rumours spread that he was a coward, and by the time Nerva did find out, the force outside Heracleia numbered almost 2,000. The propraetor quickly headed to Heracleia, but hearing of the size of the enemy force, he ordered the garrison commander of Enna, Marcus Titinius, to take 600 of his men to confront the rebels. Titinius responded quickly and marched to Mount Caprianus, drawing his men up for battle. The mountainous terrain, however, did not lend itself to the formation-focused style of battle the Romans were accustomed to. Moreover, alongside their superior numbers, many of the slaves were armed with slings, and the higher terrain gave them a distinct advantage. The battle was short, as the Romans were quickly broken, many being killed and others abandoning their weapons and fleeing the battlefield along with Titinius. This was a great victory for the slaves. Not only were they able to collect hundreds of arms and pieces of armor from the battlefield, their triumph also inspired others to join their cause. In just a few days, their numbers swelled to over 6,000. With their numbers growing, the slaves decided to elect a king, and still inspired by Eunice, they elected a man named Salvius, who, like Eunice, was famed for his divinations and prophecies.
I'm going to go ahead and stop it here. I'm going to stop it here so that we know. I just already forgot his name. Salvius. Something like that. So, anyways, this is pretty good. I'm kind of, I really kind of wanted the Spartacus thing, but the other ones are really good. What was happening on Sicily? Sicilia? That's a person. What the hell am I talking about? I'm going to end this video here because I don't know what I'm saying. So, before you go anywhere else, just remember, a lawnmower don't make good shoes.